We have half an hour only, so we would like to make use of the time. And we have collected a number of questions. And the first question is an old favorite and is as follows. Why is membership of the Universal House of Justice exclusively confined to men?
Well, the short answer to that is, I haven't the faintest idea. But I think we should think about it not within the particular square in which the question is posed, but rather think of a... you can't hear? Oh. What? Oh, then, yes, can you organize this so I can... Okay, yes, does that make sense? No? Talk in the front of it. Does that work better? Okay. Okay. Right. Well, that makes sense. Right. Whoop, no.
That doesn't make sense. Right.
It doesn't want to be talked into the front of. Right. Yes. As I say, the basic thing is I don't have the faintest idea why only men can be elected to the Universal House of Justice. But I think we should think a bit about why it's a problem. How do we conceive of elections and of the nature of election and the nature of being elected? You see, in the world as a whole, we should remember that democracies have usually evolved as a result of a struggle against a tyranny, either wresting power from the monarch, which has sort of happened in the British constitutional process, or in America, of constructing a constitution which carefully pits each of three powers against one another to counterbalance one another, because you can't trust any one of them. This is the basic thing. So democracy is regarded as a way of achieving power in order to limit power. It's all about power. And this is why you have this odd concept of winning an election. That an election is something that the person who wants to be elected wins and someone else loses. Because the elector wants to get something. Now, he may want to have power for beneficial ideas. He may want knowledge for the good of the people. He may also want power for very bad ideas. Hitler was elected democratically in Germany and then got the power and misused it. But it's all about power and the limiting of power. Now, my point is that I think in the Bahai administration, that's a totally a misconception. Bahai elections have nothing to do with power. The Bahai elections and the whole Bahai administration is to do with service. And nobody ever seeks to be elected or appointed. Although I remember we did have a letter once to the House of Justice from an individual Bahai saying he thought he'd make a very good councillor. But that's not the normal approach, because it isn't the Bahai concept. You don't say, I would like to be a chairman of a local assembly. How do I get myself elected? It just shouldn't occur to Baha'is. The whole Baha'i process gives absolute freedom to the electors and no freedom at all to those who are elected, or very little freedom. There are no nominations, there's no electioneering. The electors are left free to use their own sense as to who they think are the 9 people best suited to be on this particular body. And they vote. Now, the 9 people who are elected are not given a choice as to whether or not they want to serve. The Guardian said he deprecated refusal to serve. If you're elected, boy, you serve, unless there's some very strong reason why you can't, in which case you ask the Assembly, please, would they excuse you and allow you to resign? Which is what happens to members of the House of Justice when they get decrepit like me. You have to ask the House of Justice, may I please resign because I can't do my work properly? The House of Justice says, yes, okay, and then you can resign. And that's what's happened in each case where members of the House of Justice resigned, not because they're a certain age or anything, just because they've come to the conclusion that they couldn't carry on their work as the House required it to be carried on. So that's the situation. The voter conveys authority to the people it elects. But the power, as the Guardian says in the Baha'i faith, is in the hands of the individual believers. The assembly can do nothing unless the individual believers do what they're guided to do. So the thinking is that the people who are voting are conveying authority upon a group of people to carry out what they believe in their own judgment is the right thing. Therefore, it's quite wrong for anybody who is elected to think, good, now I've got some power, I can get this done. That's not his job. His job, or her job, is to serve on the assembly as a member of a consultative body to find out what is the correct thing to do in that particular situation, taking into account the wishes of the Baha'is and the conditions of the Baha'is. So what, therefore, does this mean? The women, as far as the Universal House of Justice is concerned, it's only that body. It's not all the other bodies in the Baha'i faith, appointed or elected, are open to men and women. The only thing happens is that women are not permitted to be elected to the Universal House of Justice. But then this isn't an exemption or a refusal to give them power, but it's an exemption for having to perform a service. Everybody else in the world, if they're elected, all the men have to perform it. You can't have a man who's elected to the House of Justice saying, "Sorry, I'm too busy. I'm in the middle of my career. I'm a great artist. Please, I can't." David Rue was like that. He was a fine doctor, and he was an expert in medical education, and he loved that. And he was about to resign from the American NSA, or asked if he could, to get back to his profession when he was elected to the House of Justice. And no one asked any more questions. He was elected. And he had to serve, and he managed to struggle on and do some medical work afterwards. So this is the way you should think about it. Now, if it's an exemption from performing a service, maybe you should say, all right, this is not very polite to the women, but that's an interpretation. But it is an exemption in that sense. It's not something they're entitled to have, some power they're entitled to get, which you're depriving them of. Now, this is just my own thinking about it, but I think that's what you have to do. You have to think outside the square, in other words, of what is the nature of service, what is the nature of administration, and what is the concept of power and authority in the Baha'i community. Then, ultimately, I think we'll say, as the Baha'u'llah says, time will come, it'll be as clear as the noonday. But at the moment, I think it isn't. I don't even understand it. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. The next question. Please tell us something more about the personality of Shoghi Efendi. For example, about his voice, how he chanted, how he smiled, and his sense of humour.
I never heard Shoghi Efendi chant because the Westerners didn't. He chanted in the presence of the Eastern men in the shrine. He used to take them to the shrine and chant to them there. But I'm sure he must have had a very melodious chanting voice. The Persian friends who heard him said he did. And his speaking voice was very melodious. It was a strong voice. It wasn't a loud voice, but it was strong and very clear. And he spoke beautiful English. He was very quite sort of clear in his thinking. One night he got us to look at the map of the world that he was designing, and he was his hands were quite pointed, and he was pointing out various things. Just vigorous hands, you might say, not strong hands, yes, but vigorous. And he had very beautiful hands, fine and nicely formed. And Rahir Khanum said that the greatest holy leaf used to get Shoghi Effendi's hands and say, "These are my father's hands," and because they had hands very like those of Baha'u'llah. And his humour, he had a very, very acute sense of humour. But one night, I remember, we were looking at designs for temples, and he got Rahir Khanum to get out the designs that had been rejected for the temple in Tehran. And they were most peculiar. And one of them, he got Anna Grossman to hold up so we could see it. And he said, "Look, Anna, looks like a frog. Anna, what's the German for a frog?" And Anna couldn't get it out. She was laughing, and so she couldn't get out the German word "frosch." But then the Guardian began to laugh. And I think he was of that generation which wasn't polite to laugh out loud. He didn't guffaw. He sort of bubbled with laughter. But everyone who knew him said he had a very, very acute sense of humour and a very lovely sense of humour. As I say, he was very kindly. And he was very understanding to people. One of Ruhiya Khan's favourite stories is about the Guardian and Charles Dunning. Now, Charlie Dunning was a wonderful Bahai, a strange little man, a sailor, and he looked like Popeye. And he used to, at the table, the Guardian would sit here, and Charlie would sit there at the end of the table because he was a Knight of Baha'u'llah. And they would lean towards one another and talk, you see. And he would sort of wave his finger at the Guardian's nose and say, "Shoghi Efendi, they tell me so and so and so and so," you see. And the Guardian would, like an old crony, lean towards him. And they would talk in this way. And he just loved Charlie Dunning. He saw the beauty and the spirit in Charlie, although most people would think he's a funny little man. And the thing that struck me was after Charlie had been on pilgrimage, and this made me think an awful lot about the way that one's appearance mirrors one's soul, you might say, because Charlie spoke at the convention about his pilgrimage. And the thing that struck me is superficially, Charlie was an ugly little man. But when he was talking, he was beautiful. Really beautiful. And he didn't change, his features were the same. But this was a beautiful person talking. And I think he was just, his soul was, as it were, reflecting what the Guardian, as it were, had seen in him. So this is just some of the characteristics of the Guardian, but it isn't very much, because I'm not very good at explaining. It just, Shoghi Efendi, in a sense, is inexplicable. I just wish you could have all met him.
Thank you. How would you explain the concept of the infallibility of the universal house of justice to a seeker?
Infallibility is such a difficult word to define. And if possible, I think, for a seeker, unless the seeker is very close to the faith, avoid the issue. Because it sounds so strange in a Western ear, and is linked up, of course, with the concept of papal infallibility in the minds of Western people, and which we have a sort of prejudice against to start with. In a sense, it's the culmination of consultation. In other words, the principle of consultation is that one mind is generally not enough. That it's good for several people to consult together with the idea of achieving a good solution. And this is simply a process of the interrelationship of human beings, of the creating a bigger mind than one. And you see, it isn't only the universal house of justice, it's the Abdu'l-Baha said that if a local spiritual assembly consults in the right way, it will receive divine guidance. Now, as it puts itself in harmony with the spirit of the universe. And what it does, it decides the right things. The only difference between the local assembly and the universal house of justice is it always achieves such a decision. Now, that's an oversimplification. It's a way you might explain it to a seeker. In other words, this is a way of electing people in various stages who know the faith well enough that when they consult together, they produce a decision that's in harmony with the facts and with the nature of the universe, and therefore, in that sense, is infallible. I think it's much more than that, and it's difficult to specify it. I mean, most consultations of the House of Justice are just like any assembly consultation. A consensus emerges. But then the House of Justice has to be much more patient in getting its decision. It knows it has to be the right decision. And I remember one occasion where we got to the point where 8 of the 9 members were thoroughly agreed to one particular course of action, and one member didn't. And the reaction of the other 8 was, what has he seen that we haven't? And to continue consulting. And in one occasion, I remember, it ended up with all the other 8 agreeing with the 9th. But I've seen similar situations where we still thought that we hadn't quite got it, and we asked to consult on, and eventually the majority decided, no, we have understood it. We just don't agree, that's all. And they make a majority decision. But it needs careful thinking and the wish to get the right answer. Sometimes, the Guardian said he would occasionally be given unusual insights as a result of the power of Baha'u'llah. It wasn't his own capacity, it was Baha'u'llah wanted him to know something, and he knew it. And the story, I heard of the Guardian coming into the room one day, waving an unopened letter, saying, he's lying! Now, he may have known the character of the person who was writing, I don't know, but that's the sort of thing that makes you sit back. But I remember one occasion when the House of Justice was discussing one question, And it was the end of the day. And it was a unanimous decision. We all wanted to do the same thing. And suddenly someone said, hadn't we better wait till tomorrow? Do we have to make this decision tonight? So we decided to wait till the next morning. The next morning in the mail came information which changed the whole picture. Now, but that's not the thing to discuss with the seeker, because it sounds peculiar. But we have to beware in the faith, when you're dealing with spiritual worlds, peculiar things can happen. But generally the House of Justice consultation is just like that of any local assembly, except from practice consultation. But as I say, it doesn't help much with the seeker. You have to judge your seeker and then see how to answer.
The next question. What pitfalls should a budding Baha'i scholar avoid?
Yes. A budding Baha'i scholar, it's obviously, you see, one has to realize what one's dealing with when one's dealing with the faith. I remember it was suggested at one time that at some Baha'i institution we should have a course of a master in Baha'i studies. And the House of Justice is impossible. You can't have a human being saying, I am a master of Baha'i studies. How big is this revelation? It's for 1,000 years or more. How can you be a master of it? It's just a terminological nonsense. You can have a master's degree in Baha'i, the application of Baha'i teachings to conflict management or something like that, but in Baha'i studies? No one's a master in Baha'i studies, but all of us are at the kindergarten stage of understanding the faith, and will be for quite a long time yet. So it's first of all getting one's understanding of the faith in perspective. To what degree can one expect to be a scholar of something that is a revelation from God to take us forward for 1 or more thousands years? Is it possible? Now, a scholar, I think, though, shouldn't ever conceive of himself as a person who has understood everything. The essence of scholarship, it seems to me, is a person who has the temperament and the skill and the capacity to study a thing seriously, to study it meticulously and seriously and carefully. That is a scholar. And a budding scholar is someone who's learning how to do this. And it's not always easy. It's very difficult in present-day society, for example, because there's... I remember I read one scholar was writing and saying that you have to have read the literature and be able to quote it. What in the world did he mean by the literature? I mean, there's all vast letters of Baha'u'llah aren't translated yet. Okay, he can't mean all Baha'i literature. He meant the writings, the published writings of other scholars in English on that subject. That isn't all the literature. It happens to be what a few scholars have written in English. What about all the Chinese scholars? Or the Indian scholars? Or the Latin American scholars? Or the German scholars? You can't read all the literature on any subject. You may read all the current one, but then you see in the pattern of modern scholarship, it isn't simply a matter of scholarship, of understanding something, but you've got a body of people who are engaged in academia and who, out of courtesy, should say, if Mr. Smith has read Mr. Jones's book and he's involved in his thinking, out of courtesy he should mention he's read Mr. Jones's book. You see, that's where you have to quote your sources and give your references to other people. But how you conceive of that, are you going to say because of this scholar who's done a great deal of study in this area has got these ideas that his scholarship is worthless because he hasn't read all this and that and that and that? It may not be worthless. It may just have gaps. So I think if budding Baha'i scholars get into the idea of thinking that whatever they produce is in its essence full of gaps, and be contented with that, and try to decrease the number of gaps, to increase the accuracy of what they're saying, to be meticulous. That, I think, is the way to do scholarship. And then you can do all sorts of things, but one has to be devoted to the truth of the matter, not necessarily to certain patterns of scholarship. Because much scholarship nowadays is basically 100% materialist. And for a Baha'i to leave out everything except materialism is difficult. Sorry, that's a bit mixed up, but you know what I mean.
How do we guard against the emergence of fundamentalism within the Baha'i community?
I should think have a very good sense of humour. And patience. You know, some people are very eager, and they sound enthusiastic, but they're too enthusiastic. And then one's got to get people to be able to look around things. Does it make sense? Not merely because one's got the principle that Baha'u'llah says that one should go back to the texts. Now we should base everything on the revelation, but also on experience in life. And one of the problems people sometimes fall into, it sounds rather fundamentalist, is say, look, in this text Baha'u'llah says so and so, that's it, finish. But then they've forgotten that in another text somewhere else, Baha'u'llah says something that reads exactly the opposite. And you have to understand that and see how they relate and think about things. So a fundamentalist, temperamentally, is someone who wants to stop you thinking. And of course there's where a sense of humor comes in, because you say this is ridiculous. So if anyone says stop thinking, that's the way to stop getting into fundamentalism. Think about things, examine things. Remember the Guardian wrote, and I've heard some people say this mistake, that they say that the independent investigation of truth is until you find Baha'u'llah. After that it doesn't apply. But the Guardian has written that Baha'u'llah has enjoined the independent investigation of truth upon his followers. So why therefore do you continue investigating truth after you found Baha'u'llah? The answer is because you have the humility to recognize you're a fallible human being. And unless you keep thinking hard and investigating hard, you're not going to understand what Baha'u'llah said. You're going to misunderstand it. And that's fundamentalism. Misunderstanding and misapplying the revelation.
Thank you. How should we approach the study of the writings of Shoghi Effendi?
I think as part of one's general... one should study the writings of Shoghi Effendi as part of one's general studies. We have the Bahai law that you're meant to read the Holy Scriptures morning and evening. And I think it's very good when doing that, in the case of writings of Baha'u'llah, to make a pattern of reading always through all the writings of Baha'u'llah. Just one book after another, until you finish the lot and start again at the beginning. If you just read the bits you like, it's not the best idea. And then each time you read through the book, you enrich your understanding, which helps you the next time you read through, and you just continue to refine new things. So that's you've got to do anyway, whether you're studying the writings of Shoghi Effendi or not. But then I think it's again, you can take excerpts from the Guardian. There's the Call to the Nations or other things. You can read various summaries. But again, fundamentally, I think it's good simply to read through all his published writings, at least the major ones. Just read them through patiently and think about them, because there are many things he covered. And it's probably best to start with what the Guardian himself wrote. There are many other things. But then that isn't all you're doing in your life, because you're administering in your local community. You've got to keep looking at various things. But for an actual methodical study of the Guardian's writings, there's nothing like just going right through, reading the whole of God Passes By and all his writings like that. Just slowly, I think.
Could you please share some of your recollections of the first International Convention for the election of the Universal House of Justice in 1963?
Yeah, they're rather limited, my recollections, because, of course, I was on the council, and one of the functions of the council was to prepare for the election of the House of Justice. And so we had all the nitty-gritty work you do, I might say, about getting the ballots out and getting the delegates registered and so on. It was a very exciting time. The hands were very worried, because they were worried about anything going wrong with that election. And there were some Baha'is at that time, one or two, who had obviously set out to tour the Baha'i world, sort of donating things here, there and everywhere, and making themselves obviously very popular and very, very well known. And the House were worried that in some cases it was not being genuine. Some people were just generally generous people. In other cases, it was obviously a sort of little tacit electioneering going on. But they thought, what can we do? If we interfere, it's the same thing. We can just trust to Baha'u'llah. So they did. And none of those who were fiddle-faddling got elected. So the delegates were sensible enough, and Baha'u'llah looked after his cause well enough that problem went away. But it didn't stop the hands worrying at the time. So as part of that business of trying not to influence the ballots, when the delegates were arriving, the hands decided that no males at the World Centre would contact the delegates at all, no matter who they were. that the women in Haifa looked after all the delegates and took them on their pilgrimages and so on. I had a difficult point because I was, being the Assistant Secretary of the International Council, I had to get in touch with Bora Kavlin, who was both a member of the Council and the chairman of the American NSA. He was the member at large of the Council. And we were going to have a council meeting, and I had to get word to Bora to come and join the meeting of the council. So he was staying in a hotel called the Lev Carmel Hotel on top of the mountain. So I went up there in the evening, and the only way I could think of getting a letter to him was to sneak through the bushes in the shrubbery up to the window of the office of the hotel and pop through the window and tell the man, please give that to Mr. Kavlin. So I did that, gave him the letter, and disappeared through the bushes back out again. So Bora got his letter all right. But, and then the council had its meeting. But these are all little details of the thing, but it was part of the care the hands had in the management. Then, of course, there was a question of where to hold the election. And Rahia Khanum hoped very much we could have it in the master's house. And then one evening, Ali and I were with her, and we thought we probably could manage it if we took all the doors off the various rooms around the central hall. So she suggested we try it out. So we took all the doors off and measured all the floors and everything. We found we could just get all the delegates into that hall, and that's why it was decided to hold the election in the master's house, which is very appropriate and very wonderful. And then the spirit of the delegates was so beautiful. I mean, they were coming here to elect the Universal House of Justice, and their whole atmosphere was beautiful. They had a little pilgrimage first, and then they gathered in the master's house, and they had the election take place, and then the next day we had the results announced. So it was a very, very beautiful experience. But these little details were really all that I remember because we were involved in Haifa. Yeah.
This probably will be the last question. Of all the very many extraordinary experiences you had in the Holy Land, is it possible to single out one that was the most moving?
Oh, gosh.
Or the top 10, perhaps.
Thank you. This, I presume, is since the election of the House of Justice. I think it's almost impossible to do so because there are so many moving events. And many of them are very similar. I mean, they were moving in the sense of sad. And there were many sad things happened. The news of the martyrdoms in Iran, of other things, the murder of Inakolinga, all very sad things happened. Of joyful things, then there was the news of the results of wonderful teaching work and so on. In the process of consultation, there were some things which were very moving because two things could happen. One is the House of Justice would be consulting on a particular subject. Or a lot of people had written suggesting a subject on which the House of Justice then had to discuss. You know, this was interesting, that why do all the Baha'is suddenly want to ask these same sort of questions? And the consultation would start, and it would start in the normal way of people exchanging ideas. And then you had the feeling suddenly the consultation was taking off. And it sort of evolved way above anything that was being thought of in the earlier stages of the consultation. And you had a whole new concept, as it were, emerged in this process of consultation. And their feeling of it was one of exultation. This is right, this is what it is. And no one had thought of it before. It wasn't the House that decided we needed to discuss this, let's do it. It was events conspired that the House of Justice could consult this particular problem, and this arrived. And that was a very exalting feeling. And that's a very moving one to have. But apart from that, there's nothing particular. There's many sad things, I say, as well as happy things. And that's about it, sorry.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Unfortunately, time is now against us. We need to leave the building before 10 o'clock. It's now 10 to 10, so we have 10 minutes to leave. But before we do so, on behalf of all of you, I would like to thank, from the bottom of our hearts, Mr. Semple, for spending this extraordinary time with us, for enlightening us, inspiring us, informing us, stimulating us, challenging a lot of our, no doubt, less mature thoughts and perspectives, and for bringing us very close indeed to two institutions, the institution of the guardianship, and the person of Shoghi Effendi, and the institution of the Universal House of Justice, under whose protective, infallible, all-loving care, not just the Bahai world shelters, but ultimately the whole of mankind. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.